December 6, 1917. Halifax, Nova Scotia. At 9:04 a.m, the harbour erupted into a sun of fire. Two ships, the Mont-Blanc loaded with high explosives and the Imo, had collided in the narrow narrows. A white flash, then silence, then a wall of wind and flame tore through the city. Homes vanished. A blast wave shattered windows 50 miles away, a shock so powerful it flung anchors 2 miles inland. Thousands were gone in an instant. Snow began to fall on what was left, the city burned, frozen and broken. So how could something like this happen? Before the blast, Halifax was alive with motion. The harbour was the heart of it all, a deep ice-free port that pulsed with the rhythm of the Great War. Ships from across the Atlantic came and went daily, carrying troops, munitions and supply supplies bound for Europe. Along the docks, cranes groaned, horses clopped over cobblestones, and the salty air was thick with coal smoke and sea spray. On the slopes above, wooden houses leaned toward the water. Children walked to school bundled against the December chill. Wives hung laundry in the brittle morning sun, and men headed to the piers, to the rail yards, to the shipyards that never seemed to rest. The city was proud of its role in the war effort, proud to be useful, to matter. Across the harbour, in the small community of Richmond, families were already preparing for Christmas. The church bells echoed faintly from the hill, and the scent of bread drifted from kitchen windows. It was a morning like any other, or so it seemed, but beneath that calm danger had slipped silently into the harbour. A French ship, the Mont-Blanc, was inbound from New York, her cargo hold packed with high explosives, TNT, picric acid and barrels of benzol stacked to the ceiling. Every crate marked danger, every hatch sealed tight. She flew no warning flag. As she entered the Narrows, another vessel, the Norwegian most, was leaving, running late, pushing fast. Two ships, both carrying the urgency of war, both bound by the same narrow channel. On shore, no one noticed the mistake about to unfold. The sky was clear, the wind was still, and the people of Halifax went about their morning unaware that their city had only minutes left to exist as it had that day. The people. Halifax in 1917 was a city of contrast, half-bustling port, half-quiet town perched on the edge of a continent at war. Its people woke each day to the sound of gulls and ship horns, the clang of metal on metal, and the hum of a place that never truly slept. For years they had watched soldiers board ships bound for Europe, and they had learned to live with the strange mix of pride and fear that came with being a wartime harbour. On the south side of the harbour, longshoremen worked the piers before dawn. Their hands were rough and blackened from coal dust. They earned just enough to feed their families and heat their small wooden homes through the long Atlantic winter. Among them was Patrick Coleman, a veteran dock worker known for his quick wit and quiet patience. He had spent 2 decades guiding ships into berth and could read the sea like a book. That morning he stood in the harbour telegraph office, tapping messages for the harbour master, unaware he would become one of the first to grasp the danger steaming silently toward them. Across town, on the north side in Richmond, Anna McNeil wrapped her shawl tight against the cold as she walked her 2 young children to school. Her husband was away with the army, and like many women, she managed everything alone. The house, the ration lines, the endless worry. She stopped on her way home to talk with a neighbour about the rising cost of sugar, the talk of German U-boats, and the rumour that another convoy might be sailing soon. The harbour, always busy, was their lifeline. Further up on Citadel Hill, Constable Robert Chambers of the Halifax Police made his morning rounds. He had served through long years of peace, but now spent his days inspecting warehouses and docks, filled with munitions, coal and foodstuffs bound for the front. He'd seen reckless loading more than once, and though he didn't like to say it aloud, he knew too well how close danger lurked. It only takes one spark, he had told a colleague weeks before. Few had listened. The city itself was a patchwork of lives interwoven with the war. French sailors filled the taverns on Barrington Street. British officers strode past shop windows, and women in long coats handed out hot tea to men working through the night. The people were tired, but they were proud of their port, proud to be a part of something larger. Halifax had become the main artery of supply to Europe, and every crate, every ship, every man mattered. Children, too, had learned to live with the rumble of engines and the sight of convoys. On that morning, 10-year-old William Young crouched by the window of his classroom, watching ships move slowly through the Narrows. His teacher, Miss Fraser, scolded him gently to focus on his arithmetic, but she herself paused to look, fascinated by the constant motion of the harbour. She didn't know that among those grey hulls and cargo ships, one carried more explosive power than any bomb yet dropped in the war. At the Halifax dry dock, workers crowded around the massive hull of a damaged cruiser. Sparks showered from welders' torches, and the smell of tar filled the air. Mechanics joked about the bitter cold and the endless overtime. In the canteen, men grumbled about delayed wages, but said little else. They were used to risk. Accidents happened often. Crushed fingers, falls from rigging, burns from molten steel. They accepted it as the price of honest work. To the north, in the small Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove, life was slower. Families fished along the shore and tended fires in their simple homes, many still rebuilding from the loss of their lands decades earlier. The war felt far away, yet the harbour's energy touched even here. Men found day work hauling coal, women sold baskets to sailors, and children watched the ships with wide eyes. Everywhere there was the rhythm of ordinary life, horses pulling wagons through the slush, bells from St. Paul's Church marking the hour, the faint scent of the sea mixed with wood smoke. Halifax was alive that morning, unaware it stood at the edge of an abyss. The people carried on as they always had. Patrick Coleman checked the morning dispatches. Anna McNeil needed bread for supper. Constable Chambers returned to his patrol near Pier 6. Miss Fraser opened her classroom windows to the cold air, unaware that a ship filled with TNT and benzol had just entered the narrows below. And far out in the harbour, the crews of two vessels, the French freighter Mont-Blanc and the Norwegian relief ship Imo, were steering toward each other, both believing they had the right of way. Both bound by rules they trusted to protect them. No one on shore could see the danger gathering, a spark waiting for its moment. In the streets, a streetcar clattered down Barrington Avenue, full of workers heading home for breakfast. In the shipyard, men paused to light cigarettes. In the telegraph office, Coleman leaned closer to his machine, frowning at a garbled signal from the harbour. He began to type a warning, but by the time his fingers moved it was already too late. That morning, Halifax was a living city filled with stories that would end in seconds. A city that had no way of knowing that its people, its mothers, its dockhands, its children, would soon be caught in the heart of the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen. The warning signs. The morning of December 6, 1917 began like any other in Halifax, but out on the water 2 ships were already moving toward a collision course that would alter history. The Mont-Blanc, a French cargo ship, had entered the harbour at dawn. She was small, only about 320 feet long, but she carried the deadliest cargo ever brought into Canadian waters, more than 2,300 tons of explosive material, picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and barrels of benzol stacked like powder kegs on her deck. Each chemical alone could have been dangerous. Together, under the right spark, they formed a floating bomb of almost unimaginable force. Her captain, Aimé Lemecq, knew exactly what he carried. He had been instructed to enter Halifax because it was the last Allied port before the convoy to Europe, but the harbour had strict rules. No ship with dangerous cargo could enter or leave without an escort, and none could move through the narrow strait connecting Bedford Basin to the open sea, while another vessel was passing in the opposite direction. Still, this was wartime. Rules bent easily when ships were delayed or convoys were short on time. The Mont-Blanc's crew spoke little English. The harbour pilots spoke little French. The result was a morning filled with uncertainty, hand signals, shouted orders, and nervous glances as the freighter idled near the entrance to the Narrows, waiting for clearance. On the opposite side, at the northern end of the channel, the Imo, a Norwegian relief ship chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium, was preparing to leave port. Her captain, Håkon From, was eager to get underway. The Imo had been delayed for days, waiting on supplies and coal, and every hour lost meant missing her convoy to Europe. She was a big vessel, built for speed, and she sat high in the water, her propellers partially exposed, a sign she was light and ready to run. At 7:30 a.m, the harbour pilot aboard the Imo received clearance to depart. The sun had just risen above the horizon, and the tide was flowing out. He set a course through the Narrows, expecting a quiet passage. Few ships moved at that hour. Meanwhile, on the southern approach, Mont-Blanc's pilot, Francis Mackey, finally received word to enter. The 2 ships, one inbound, one outbound, were now steaming toward each other in the same narrow channel barely half a mile wide. The Narrows was a treacherous place even on a calm day. Its bends and shallows required careful steering, and any misjudgment could send a ship aground. That morning the wind was still, the visibility clear, and yet something in the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm no one could name. On shore, life continued in its rhythm. Telegraph operator Patrick Coleman monitored harbour traffic from his desk. He'd seen vessels pass through the Narrows 1,000 times, often with little more than a blast of the whistle or a wave from the deckhands. But as the clock neared 8:30, something in the pattern caught his eye. 2 ships showing signals that didn't align, both asserting right of way. Out on the water, the Imo had drifted too far to the wrong side of the channel, hugging the Dartmouth shore. Her pilot, trying to avoid a tugboat crossing ahead, had steered slightly to port, violating the standard rule of keeping right. The Mont-Blanc's pilot, Mackie, saw the Norwegian steamer bearing directly down on him and responded by moving closer to the Halifax side. It was a small correction, but it put him into shallower water, dangerous territory for a heavily laden vessel. The 2 ships exchanged warning blasts on their whistles, one long, one short, a signal for passage, but sound can deceive across open water. The Imo's captain misread the sequence, believing the Mont-Blanc was yielding the channel. He ordered his engines ahead. The Mont-Blanc, desperate to avoid collision, cut power and veered further toward the shore. Still, the distance between them closed with terrifying speed. On Pier 9, longshoremen stopped their work to watch. "Looks like they'll scrape," one man muttered. It wasn't uncommon for ships to pass close, but this time the gap narrowed to nothing. At 8:45 a.m., the Imo's steel bow struck the Mont-Blanc's starboard side, just forward of the bridge. The sound was not loud, more of a grinding tear than a crash, but to those nearby it was unmistakably wrong. The impact ripped a jagged hole through the French ship's hull. Sparks flew as steel met steel, and beneath the deck, surrounded by thousands of tons of explosives, dozens of barrels of benzol toppled and burst open. The liquid fuel splashed across the deck down ladders, into holes and onto the water itself. Within seconds, fumes ignited. A sheet of flame erupted, racing from bow to stern. The Mont-Blanc's crew knew instantly what it meant. "Save yourselves!" shouted Captain Lemedec in French. They had no time to fight the fire, only to escape. Abandoning ship, the men lowered lifeboats in panic and rowed frantically toward the Dartmouth shore. Behind them, the Mont-Blanc drifted, fully ablaze, carried slowly by the outgoing tide toward the heart of Halifax. On shore, people ran to windows, drawn by the sight. A burning ship in the harbour was a spectacle, not yet a warning. Children gathered along the waterfront to watch the flames. Workers paused in their yards, shading their eyes against the glare. Few understood what floated before them, a bomb whose fuse was already lit. At the naval yard, officers spotted the burning ship and ordered fireboats to respond. They didn't know its cargo. Wartime secrecy meant dangerous manifests were rarely declared. The Mont-Blanc's crew had shouted warnings in French, but the words were lost to the noise and the distance. The Imo, though damaged, reversed engines and backed away. Her captain believed the worst was over. He could not see that he had just set in motion a catastrophe greater than anything the modern world had yet witnessed. By 8:55, the Mont-Blanc had drifted toward Pier 6, her hull glowing orange, her deck engulfed. The heat was intense enough to warp nearby windows. Benzol drums exploded like artillery shells, sending black smoke twisting into the sky. In the telegraph office, Patrick Coleman received reports of a burning munitions ship in the harbour. He didn't wait for confirmation. He knew the ships by name. He knew the cargo the Mont-Blanc was carrying. At 8:58, he began tapping a warning message through the lines. Hold trains. Ammunition ship afire in harbour. Approaching Pier 6. He got halfway through before the line went dead. In the streets, crowds were forming. Workers climbed onto roofs for a better view. Mothers carried children to windows. "It's going to blow!" someone shouted, but few believed it. Halifax had seen fires before. The city had burned and rebuilt many times. This, they assumed, would be the same. Only one man in uniform, Constable Robert Chambers, began clearing the area near the docks. He moved from shop to shop, urging people to step back. "Get away from the harbour," he warned. "Something's wrong with that ship." But curiosity is a powerful thing. For every person who stepped back, 3 more came forward. Across the water in Dartmouth, the Mont-Blanc's terrified crew had reached shore. They tried to find someone who could understand them. One sailor, his hands blackened with soot, shouted in broken English, "Powder ship! Explosives!" But by then the flames had spread too far. The fireboat Patricia approached, its crew preparing hoses. They had no idea that the cargo they were about to douse could destroy them all. The captain ordered his men to get closer. The heat was unbearable, but they pressed on. Back on land, a young girl named Marion Campbell stood at her classroom window in the Richmond school watching the fire. It was like looking into the sun, she would later recall. Her teacher told the children to stay back, but none could look away. At 9 a.m, the Mont-Blanc's hull began to list. The fire had reached the forward hold where TNT and picric acid were stored. The crew, now ashore, turned away, unable to watch what came next. In the harbour office, confusion spread. Telephones rang without answers. No one knew exactly what was burning. Some believed it was oil. Others thought ammunition. But no one understood the scale. Not yet. In the minutes before the blast, Halifax was alive with the sound of bells and whistles. Alarms from the docks, warnings from ships, cries from sailors trying to make sense of chaos. A horse reared on Brunswick Street as the concussion from a smaller explosion rolled through. People began to sense it then, that something vast and terrible was coming. Coleman, still at his post, tried to send one last message. He leaned over the telegraph key, hands trembling, eyes on the harbour through a cracked window. The burning Mont-Blanc had drifted close enough that he could see the paint blistering on her side. He tapped again. "All trains hold! Munition ship burning. Danger." That message never reached its destination. At 9:04 a.m, Halifax's fate was sealed. In hindsight, the warning signs had been there all along, but they were scattered, divided by language, distance, and human error. The Emo's impatience, the Mont-Blanc's secrecy, the harbour's confusion, each mistake small enough to seem ordinary, but together enough to doom a city. No single man caused what was coming. No single decision could have stopped it. It was the collision of worlds, military urgency, civilian routine, and the cruel simplicity of physics. The harbour masters would later testify that both captains had followed rules as they understood them. The pilots would insist they signalled correctly. The officers on shore would say they never knew what cargo burned in the bay. All were right in their own way, and yet all were wrong. By the time the truth was clear, it was too late. The Mont-Blanc floated at the centre of the harbour like a dying star, glowing hotter by the second. Crowds lined the shore, their faces lit orange by the reflection of flame. The sound of crackling fire mixed with distant sirens. In homes across the city, people paused over breakfast or stepped outside to see what the commotion was about. It was 9:03 a.m. 1 minute remained. Men along the docks shaded their eyes. Children pressed faces to the glass. Nurses at the Richmond hospital opened windows to look out. On Citadel Hill, soldiers training with rifles turned toward the harbour. At Pier 6, the air shimmered with heat. A sailor aboard a nearby tugboat would later describe it as like standing beside a furnace door. He saw something fall from the Mont-Blanc's deck, perhaps a hatch cover, perhaps a drum, and then, for the briefest instant, silence. The sky flashed white. The signs had all been there, whispered in steam whistles, buried in misread signals, ignored in the rush of war. Halifax had only needed to listen, but like so many tragedies, the warnings were clear only in retrospect, and in the space of 1 minute, every missed signal, every careless decision would converge into a single moment of blinding light. At this moment, the disaster unfolds. It's 9:04 a.m. For 1/10,000th of a second, Halifax ceased to exist as a city and became light. The explosion began deep inside the Mont-Blanc's forward hold, heat meeting pressure, pressure meeting chemistry. And in that instant, 2,925 tons of explosives ignited at once. The reaction tore through the ship faster than sound could carry it. A fireball 1,000 feet wide bloomed over the harbour, rising into the cold December sky with the brightness of a newborn sun. Every atom of air within a half-mile ignited. The blast consumed the oxygen itself, turning breath into flame. The sea boiled, the earth convulsed, and the air turned solid for the briefest moment before hurling itself outward. The wave struck the water first. The Mont-Blanc was obliterated, not shattered, but vaporized. Its steel hull transformed into a storm of molten fragments hurled across the city. The blast carved a crater in the harbour floor and sent a column of steam and debris 2 miles high. Then came the air. The shock wave raced outward at more than 1,000 feet per second, flattening everything in its path. On the Halifax side, entire blocks vanished. Brick walls folded like paper, roofs lifted, turned inside out, and scattered into the sky. Houses rose from their foundations and shattered mid-air. At the waterfront, a blast of pressure pulverized the Richmond district. Within a single breath, the neighborhood was gone, a mile of homes, shops, and schools erased. The Richmond school, filled with children who had pressed to the windows to watch the burning ship, disappeared in a single instant. The temperature at the heart of the blast reached 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees burst into flame where they stood. Iron melted and flowed down the cobblestones. Windows shattered 50 miles away. A pressure of thousands of tons per square inch slammed through the air, rolling across the city like a physical wall. In downtown Halifax, the blast struck with a sound beyond comprehension. Part thunder, part scream, part silence. A church steeple was ripped from its foundation and thrown a quarter mile. Telegraph poles snapped like twigs. Rail cars weighing 10 tons were picked up and hurled into the streets. The air itself became a weapon. People were flung through doorways and across rooms. The shock wave ripped the clothes from their bodies, stripped paint from houses, and drove splinters through walls like bullets. In the naval dockyard, steel beams twisted into pretzels. In hospitals, windows burst inward, showering glass over patients and nurses alike. At Citadel Hill, soldiers drilling with rifles dropped to the ground, ears bleeding. They looked up to see the harbour replaced by a cloud of fire rising in slow, terrible silence. Across the water in Dartmouth, the wave struck seconds later. Every window shattered. Sawmills along the shore caught fire. Workers were thrown into the harbour by the blast wind, the air still screaming with the heat of the explosion. Then came the wave, the physical surge of the sea displaced by the blast. A wall of water 40 feet high rushed outward from the centre of the harbour, sweeping docks, ships, and people back toward shore. Vessels that had been moored along the piers were tossed onto the land like toys. The Imo, the ship whose bow had started it all, was lifted and slammed against the Dartmouth shore, its hull mangled, its bridge crushed. Within 30 seconds, more than 2,000 people were dead or dying. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. For 5 or 6 seconds there was nothing, no air, no motion, only the ringing emptiness that follows total destruction. Then came the wind returning, rushing inwards to fill the vacuum left by the blast. It howled through the wreckage like the breath of the world itself. Where Richmond had stood, there was now a plain of fire and splinters. Houses burned where they had collapsed. Entire families lay beneath the ruins of what had been kitchens, parlours, or stairwells. In the city centre, survivors stumbled through the smoke, deaf and bleeding. Their clothes burned from their bodies. Horses screamed in the streets, crushed beneath fallen wagons. A trolley car lay on its side, wheels still spinning. The sky had turned white, then grey, then red, a cloud of smoke and ash that blotted out the sun. Embers rained down like snow. The telegraph office, where Patrick Coleman had sent his warning, was gone. His message, "Hold trains, ammunition ship afire in harbour," had been his last act. The inbound passenger train from Truro halted miles outside the city, spared only by that single unfinished transmission. Coleman himself was never found. Fires broke out across the city. Coal bins, oil tanks, and wooden roofs ignited from the heat. The wind fanned the flames through what remained of Richmond, turning rubble into a furnace. Smoke rose in black pillars that could be seen 50 miles away. At the Richmond rail yard, boxcars loaded with supplies burned fiercely. Men ran towards the wreckage, pulling survivors from the tracks, their faces blackened and hands raw. The heat was unbearable, yet they kept going, crawling through debris, following the sound of faint cries. A soldier stationed on Citadel Hill later wrote, "It was like watching the end of the world, and yet it was happening to our own city." By 9:10 a.m, the first sounds of realization began. The moans of the wounded, the distant crackle of fires, the groan of collapsing beams. Somewhere under the rubble, church bells still rang, struck not by hands but by the vibration of the blast. The north end of Halifax was gone. Streets had ceased to exist, landmarks vanished. The air smelled of sulphur and salt, burning timber and scorched iron. In the hospital district, nurses who had survived moved instinctively, tearing sheets for bandages, carrying the injured to what remained of the corridors. One nurse wrote later that she looked outside and saw a world turned inside out, no roofs, no windows, only light and dust. Aboard ships anchored miles from shore, sailors were thrown from their decks. The shockwave rolled over them like a physical blow, and seconds later the falling debris followed unmovable. Metal shards, chains, and fragments of hull raining down from the sky. One of the Mont-Blanc's anchors, weighing more than half a ton, landed 2 miles inland in the woods near Armdale. Another fragment, part of the ship's cannon, embedded itself in the ground at Albro Lake, more than 3 miles away. Even miles beyond the city, farmers looked up to see the sky glowing. Windows shattered in villages across Nova Scotia. The shockwave crossed the Bay of Fundy and was felt as far away as Prince Edward Island. And then, as if destruction were not enough, nature delivered a second blow. The explosion had displaced millions of gallons of water. The harbour drained and then surged back in a sudden tsunami, sweeping across the burning shoreline. It carried ships inland, smashed wharves to splinters, and drowned dozens who had survived the blast itself. The tide washed burning debris and oil through the streets, spreading the fires further into the city. On the Dartmouth side, the Mi'kmaq settlement at Turtle Grove was erased. The waves swept through the small community, flattening homes and carrying entire families out to sea. By 9:20 a.m, Halifax was a city in flames. Smoke darkened the sky, and a snow of ash fell across the ruins. Survivors staggered through the wreckage in silence, unable to hear each other's voices through the ringing in their ears. Doctors and soldiers who had escaped the initial blast began to move toward the devastation, though they could not yet comprehend its scale. Many thought it was an air raid, a German attack, or the end of the war itself. The clock tower at Fort Needham had stopped it at exactly 9:04 a.m, the moment the harbour became fire. As the smoke thickened over Halifax, the city seemed to fade into another world, one where the familiar order of streets and names and landmarks had vanished. The air shimmered with heat and dust. The sun became a pale disk behind a rolling ceiling of ash. For the next hour, the wind carried a low, constant roar, not from the explosion itself, but from the fires that followed it. Coal sheds, oil tanks, and lumber piles burned like torches. The flames fed on the splintered ruins of entire neighbourhoods, leaping from block to block in a chain of orange and black. Along what had once been Barrington Street, telegraph wires lay tangled across the road, sparking where they touched the rails. The smell of ozone mixed with the stench of burning flesh. Men stumbled through the haze, calling for wives, for sons, for anyone still breathing. Some found no words at all, only the slow animal sound of grief. In the wreckage of the Richmond district, the blast's centre, the landscape looked lunar. Every house had collapsed. The few survivors crawled over smoking timber, blinded by dust. Many had been struck by flying glass, some were without clothing, their skin shredded and burned. The blast had scoured them clean. A woman staggered down what had been Campbell Road, carrying a child in her arms, not realising the child was already gone. Nearby, a horse still harnessed to a wagon stood motionless, its hide seared black. The only movement came from the fire advancing through the ruins, devouring what remained. Farther inland, at the rail yards, twisted locomotives lay half buried. Engineers who had survived the first shock threw open the boilers to vent steam, trying to prevent secondary explosions. Coal fires burned hot enough to melt the rails themselves, and yet the men stayed, hammering with bare hands to free those trapped beneath the cars. At the naval dockyard, sailors organised bucket lines. They poured water from the harbour onto flaming piles of wreckage, though the harbour itself now floated with oil and bodies. Flames danced on the surface of the water. Aboard the hospital ship Nevada, moored farther out, the deck was littered with glass and splinters. The crew rushed to treat the injured, hauled aboard by small boats. Men, women, and children burned beyond recognition. A surgeon later wrote, "We worked until our hands stuck to the instruments." On Gottingham Street, what had been one of Halifax's busiest thoroughfares was a field of debris. Streetcars lay overturned, their steel frames warped by heat. Shop fronts were torn open like cardboard boxes. The few walls still standing leaned at impossible angles. At Citadel Hill, the fortress overlooking the harbour, soldiers stared down into the clouded valley. From that height, they could see the pattern of devastation. a vast semicircle of ruin spreading north from the water, fire consuming its centre, smoke rising in a slow spiral into the sky. No one spoke for a long time. Finally an officer whispered, "There's nothing left." Down at Dartmouth the scene was scarcely better. The sawmills and factories along the shore had burned to the ground. The shockwave had hurled lumber through the air like javelins, impaling trees and walls. The tsunami had carried fishing boats 100 yards inland and left them resting on rooftops. In the mudflats, oil fires flickered like candles over the dead. The blast had not only destroyed Halifax, it had wounded its soul. In less than 10 seconds, nearly every church, every school, every public hall north of Duke Street had been flattened. More than a quarter of the city's population was dead, dying or injured. 10,000 people were homeless in the cold, and still the fires grew. By mid-morning, the city's few surviving water mains had ruptured. Firemen stood helpless, watching the flames leap from house to house. They used snow, beer, and even molasses from shattered warehouses to smother what they could. At the rail yard, soldiers tore doors from boxcars to use as stretchers. Anything that could carry the wounded became a makeshift ambulance. At 10 a.m, a column of soldiers from the garrison began moving toward the ruins of Richmond. They found the ground so hot it burned through their boots. Smoke obscured the sun, the air tasted of salt and iron. The men advanced by crawling, shouting into cellars, listening for muffled voices. A few survivors were pulled free, many were not. Across the harbour, the IMO lay half-sunken, her decks burning. Crewmen who had escaped the impact now watched helplessly as fire consumed their ship. They could see the ruins of Halifax glowing like a forge and hear faintly the cries of thousands. By late morning, the blast cloud had drifted north, forming a towering mushroom visible from 50 miles away. Fishermen at sea saw it and assumed Halifax had been bombed. The sound had been heard across Nova Scotia, across the Bay of Fundy, even on the coast of Maine. In Boston, seismographs recorded the tremor. Back in the city, a strange darkness settled. Smoke and dust blotted out daylight, turning noon into dusk. Snow began to fall, however, the ash mixing with real flakes from a storm moving in from the Atlantic. The white flakes turned grey before they touched the ground. Through that dim light, the survivors moved like shadows. They wrapped the injured in curtains, tablecloths, whatever cloth they could find. Churches became hospitals, school basements became morgues. The sound of hammering returned as men used boards to make splints and coffins alike. In the heart of the ruins, a single church bell still rang. Its tower had collapsed, but the bell, half buried, swung back and forth with each gust of wind, a slow, mournful rhythm echoing through the valley of fire. As the afternoon wore on, the scale of destruction began to register beyond the city. Trains from Truro and Windsor halted miles away, blocked by twisted rails. Telegraph lines were down, but fragments of messages reached the outside world. Halifax destroyed, of thousands dead, send help. The first rescue trains were loaded almost blindly. Doctors, nurses, and supplies bound for a city no one could describe. They would arrive hours later to scenes of ruin that defied belief. But in those first terrible hours, Halifax stood alone. At 11 a.m, the fires met the snow. Steam rose from the wreckage as flakes hissed on glowing embers. The smell of charred timber mixed with salt and smoke. Those still able to walk began to gather at the common, the wide green space near the centre of the city, a place that had become, by chance, the edge of survival. There hundreds shivered together in silence, staring toward the harbour that had betrayed them. From that hill they could see the outlines of what had been their home. The harbour now a vast bowl of steam and ash. The shoreline twisted, the air still humming with heat. No one spoke of cause or blame, they simply watched. The sound of the fires and the falling snow their only companions. By evening the storm deepened. The temperature dropped, the wind rose, and snow began to cover the dead. The fire's orange glow flickered beneath the white, an eerie light that pulsed across the ruins. The city was silent except for the distant crash of collapsing timbers and the low murmur of survivors searching the rubble by lantern light. Night fell on a place that no longer looked like Halifax. The harbour, once alive with ships and cranes, was a field of floating wreckage. The waterfront was gone, the streets were gone, the laughter, the bells, the rhythm of the working port, all gone. The disaster had lasted less than a second, but its echo would last a century. As midnight came, the snow continued to fall. The fires dimmed, leaving only smoke rising into the dark. Those still standing looked out over their broken city, their faces grey with ash, their eyes reflecting the orange glow fading behind the clouds. They did not yet know that help was already on the way, trains racing from Truro, from Moncton, from Boston, carrying doctors, nurses, and supplies through the night. For now there was only silence and the slow realization of what had been lost. In that moment, Halifax became something else entirely, a city reborn in grief, its people bound by the shared breath of survival. The rescue and aftermath. By dawn on December 7th, the fires had burned themselves low, but the smoke still clung to the city like a shroud. The snowstorm that arrived overnight had covered the ruins in a strange, quiet whiteness. From a distance it almost looked peaceful as sin, until you stepped closer and saw what the snow concealed. Every street was a trench of ash and ice. Roof beams jutted from frozen drifts like ribs. The harbour was a field of wreckage crusted in sleet, the surface littered with shattered boats and blackened timbers, and everywhere silence, the stunned kind that follows unimaginable loss. Those who had survived moved through the wreckage like ghosts. Some searched for family, some for food, others for the dead. They used doors as sleds to drag bodies to the common, where makeshift morgues had formed under the open sky. Fires smouldered beneath the snow. The air smelled of wet ash and salt. Then faintly at first came the sound of whistles in the distance. Trains. Help was arriving. The first relief train from Truro reached the edge of the city before dawn. The engineer had driven through blinding snow, guided only by the dim glow of the burning harbour ahead. On board were doctors, nurses, railwaymen, and volunteers carrying bandages, food, and blankets. They stepped into a world that scarcely resembled a city. One doctor later wrote, "We could not tell where streets had been." We followed the smell of smoke and the sound of voices. They found hospitals overflowing with the injured, some lying on floors, others on stretchers made from doors and shutters. Many were blind from the flash. The explosion's light had burned their retinas before the shockwave reached them. Surgeons worked by candlelight, their instruments freezing in the cold. There were no morphine supplies left by noon. Still, they worked. In the ruins of Richmond, soldiers and volunteers formed rescue lines, digging by hand through snow and debris. When they found a survivor, they passed them gently down the line, wrapped in blankets, silent except for the sound of shovels striking wood. When they found the dead, they marked the spot with a branch and moved on. Children were carried out in the arms of strangers. Dogs barked at the air, sensing those still trapped beneath. The smell of gas leaks and smoke hung heavy, making every rescue dangerous. But the digging never stopped. By midday, more trains had arrived, from Windsor, Moncton, and Amherst. The most famous came from Boston, carrying doctors and nurses who had set out the moment the news reached them. They rode through the night, ploughing through snowdrifts and fallen trees, unsure what they would find. The people of Halifax would never forget that gesture. For decades to come, the city would send Boston a Christmas tree each year, a living thank you for the help that came through the storm. Throughout the day, survivors gathered at the Halifax Common, huddled around fires built from broken furniture. Priests and ministers moved among them, offering what comfort they could, and prayed aloud. Others sat in silence, staring at the smoke still rising from the harbour. At the dockyard, sailors continued to pull bodies from the water. The tide had carried hundreds ashore. The heat of the fires had been so intense that many could only be identified by rings, watches, or buttons. In the warehouses that remained standing, the Red Cross established triage centres. Nurses from the Nevada and nearby towns took turns treating burns and frostbite, dressing wounds with whatever cloth they could find. As night fell again, Halifax was a city transformed by loss, but bound by a strange determination. Strangers shared bread, blankets, and stories. Those who could still walk helped those who could not. Every able hand worked, digging, carrying, building fires, comforting the wounded. By the second day, telegraph lines were restored enough to send word of survival. Messages flashed across Canada, Halifax lives. The casualty list grew longer by the hour, 2,000 dead, 9,000 injured, 6,000 homeless, entire families erased. Yet within days, tents rose on the common, and the army began clearing streets. Food stations opened in churches. Trains brought lumber for coffins. then lumber for new homes. In the midst of ruin, the work of rebuilding had already begun. The snowstorm that had seemed like a curse on that first night proved a strange blessing. It had smothered many of the fires and preserved the injured from exposure. Without it, the death toll would have been far higher. By the end of the week, the city had power again. Hospitals ran on generators. Refugees found shelter in schools and army barracks. Letters from across Canada and the United States poured in money, clothing, prayers. Halifax, once a forgotten port on the edge of the Atlantic, had become a symbol of human endurance. On December 10th, as the last of the mass graves were filled, a quiet ceremony was held at Fort Needham overlooking the harbour. Soldiers, nurses and dock workers stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow, heads bowed. Below them, the water that had burned so fiercely now lay still, covered with thin ice. A chaplain spoke only a few words. They did not fall in battle, but they gave their lives in service. We shall not forget them. And for a moment, the city was silent again, not with shock this time, but with remembrance. The legacy and reflection. When the smoke finally cleared and the last embers died, Halifax looked like the surface of another planet. Streets once lined with homes were bare earth. The harbour's edge, once alive with cranes and whistles, had become a graveyard of hulls. Even the air felt changed, heavy, metallic, as though it carried memory itself. But amid the ruin, life returned. Slowly, stubbornly, people began to rebuild. The first task was survival, food, shelter, warmth. The Army and Navy took control of the city within days, organising relief under military command. Field kitchens opened in the barracks, serving soup and bread to long lines of men and women still dressed in rags of their former lives. Children clung to strangers' coats, unsure where their parents had gone. Names were written on scraps of paper and tacked to the doors of schools and churches, turning them into bulletin boards of the missing. By Christmas, less than 3 weeks after the explosion, Halifax was no longer just mourning. It was rebuilding. Carpenters from across the Maritimes arrived by train. Engineers from Ottawa surveyed the ruins. The federal government established the Halifax Relief Commission, which would oversee reconstruction for years to come. Money poured in from Montreal, Toronto, New York and London. But perhaps the most heartfelt aid came from Boston, whose people had sent their doctors through a snowstorm before they even knew the scale of what had happened. Halifax would never forget that. Out of the devastation rose new streets, new neighbourhoods, and a new sense of responsibility. The North End, where Richmond had once stood, became the site of the first public housing project in Canadian history, carefully planned with fireproof construction, wide roads, and modern sanitation. It was designed not only to replace what had been lost, but to prove that a city could learn from tragedy. Laws changed too. Maritime traffic regulations were rewritten. Communication between ships and harbours became standardised and multilingual. Dangerous cargoes were labelled and declared, no longer hidden behind wartime secrecy. Every naval officer who served in those years learned the story of the Mont-Blanc, a lesson paid for in lives. But the legacy of the explosion was not written only in policy or architecture. It was etched in the hearts of those who had seen it. For decades afterward, Haligonians would talk about the blast in hushed voices, as if naming it aloud might conjure its echo. Children who had survived grew up with scars they could not hide and others they could not describe. Many who lost their sight that morning learned to live again through the Halifax School for the Blind, whose classrooms filled with students burned by the flash. Doctors called them the children of the light that blinded. Yet even amid loss there were miracles. A baby found alive in the rubble after 2 days. A sailor thrown half a mile who somehow lived. A violin recovered from the ashes, its strings melted, but its body intact. Each small survival became a symbol, proof that even in destruction something endures. The city's identity changed. Halifax was no longer just a port or a wartime hub. It had become a community defined by resilience. When the Second World War came decades later, older residents looked to the harbour with both pride and fear. They remembered what war could do, not on distant shores, but at home. In time, the scars faded, and the city grew, the North End filled with new houses and new families. Streetcars rattled once again down Barrington Street. Ships returned to the harbour. But memory has a way of anchoring itself to place. Even as buildings rose and children laughed, the ground beneath them carried the past. fragments of glass, charred wood, and twisted steel buried just below the soil. Each year, on December 6th, the city paused. At 9:04 a.m, church bells rang together across Halifax, not as an alarm this time, but as remembrance. For 1 minute, the harbour fell silent. Buses stopped. Workers stood still. The sound of those bells carried out over the water where the Mont-Blanc had once burned, then faded into the open Atlantic. From tragedy also came tradition. In gratitude for Boston's aid, Halifax began sending a Christmas tree to the city each year. A gift cut from Nova Scotia's forests, shipped south across the same waters that once burned. It still stands every December on Boston Common, its lights glowing against the winter sky, a living reminder of a bond forged in disaster. A century later, the story of the Halifax explosion remains both history and warning. It was the largest man-made explosion the world had ever known before the atomic age, so vast that its shockwaves circled the globe. Scientists would later study it to understand the physics of blast waves. Generals would study it to measure destruction. But for Halifax, it was never about science or war. It was about people. Ordinary citizens caught between the machinery of conflict and the accidents of chance. It revealed, with painful clarity, the cost of haste, the danger of secrecy, and the fragility of daily life. A missed signal, a wrong turn, a moment of misunderstanding, and a city gone. Yet what followed proved something deeper, that even when the world ends in fire, humanity rebuilds from ash. Halifax rose again, not in defiance but in memory. Streets once levelled became neighbourhoods filled with life. The harbour that once roared with flame returned to calm, reflecting the ships that came after, ships that sailed because others had fallen. Today, when you stand on Fort Needham Hill and look down at the water, the city seems serene. The houses spread across the slopes, the masts rise from the docks, and gulls wheel above the narrows where the two ships met. A simple memorial stands there now, granite walls inscribed with names. The wind moves through the trees, and in the quiet you can almost hear the faint echo of a whistle, the hum of a city that once woke to fire. Every December, candles burn along the harbour front. School children recite the stories of those who lived and those who didn't. And for a brief moment, Halifax becomes again what it was that morning before the blast, a city united by ordinary life. The sound of footsteps on snow, the call of a ship's horn, the smell of salt and coal smoke in the air. The lesson of the Halifax explosion is not just about what was lost, but about what endured. Courage, compassion, and the will to begin again. The people of Halifax learned that survival is not a single act, but 1,000 small ones, a hand extended, a meal shared, a city rebuilt beam by beam. When the harbour fell silent, Canada learned what it cost to rebuild itself. And in that silence, broken only by the sound of waves against the pier, Halifax was reborn.